Okay, dear friends, colleagues, students, good evening. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Gillian White Lecture on behalf of the Manchester International Law Centre and the Women in International Law Network. We are very delighted to have our guest speaker, Dr. Christiane Ahlborn, who is Assistant Professor at Trinity College, Dublin. I will not take any time and I will hand over directly to our Head of Department, Professor Javier Oliva. And yes, I need to give you my microphone, I think.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today, and in particular our distinguished speaker, Professor Christiane Ahlborn. As you all know, the Gillian White Lecture is one of the highlights of MILC every single year, but also the wider Department of Law, which I represent. The title for Dr. Ahlborn's presentation immediately captured my attention. I have no doubt that this afternoon's discussion will meet the high standard that we can to expect. Maintaining academic excellence is undoubtedly critical for us, honoring Gillian White and her legacy at a time when women face even greater barriers than they do in contemporary society. Gillian White carved a successful university career in the teeth of prejudice, lacking the benefit of equality law protections during the formative and middle years of her career. It must have felt as though she was swimming against a riptide at times, and this achievement deserves due recognition. In 1975, Gillian White became the first woman to be appointed a professor in mainland Britain, and I'm extremely proud that this took place here at the University of Manchester. It should be noted that this was the same year that saw the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, making it illegal to discriminate against individuals based on their sex or marital status in employment, training, and education, as well as in the provision of goods, facilities, and services. When White began her journey as a research assistant to Sir Elihu Lauterpacht at the University of Cambridge in 1961, it was only 33 years since women had gained the vote on the same terms as men. She remained there until 1967, when she moved out here to Manchester, where she happily remained until her retirement in 1991. Her chair was in international law, and it seems very fitting that her work was dedicated to ensuring the collective project of making sure that justice is in place for the entire human family. The same could be said of our distinguished speaker tonight, Professor Ahlborn. She is a general international lawyer with research interests and expertise in diverse areas within that field. They include topics as wide-ranging as the law of international responsibility, the law of treaties, the law of international organizations, theories of international law, sustainable development law, international human rights law, international refugee law, and international law and technologies. Is absolutely impressive. Christiane is, of course, based at Trinity College, Dublin, where she teaches modules and supervises students in public international law, the law of international organizations, and refugee and immigration law. An extremely interesting and varied package. Externally, she is a co-chair of the United Nations Law Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association, a member of the ILA Committee on Business and Human Rights and Urbanization and International Law, as well as a former member of the ILA Study Group on UN Sanctions and former co-rapporteur of the ILA Study Group on Responsibility of International Organizations. Absolutely impressive achievements, as you can see. Professor Ahlborn's topic for this evening is the new international economic disorder on law, privatization, and power. The context for this is that in 1976, Gillian White published her famous article, the new international economic order in the Virginia Journal of International Law, concluding that a climate in which some genuine amelioration is possible. Sadly, sitting here half a century later, it is all too apparent that the potential for improvement identified by Professor White has not been realized in the intervening years, and the heralded new international economic order did not come to pass. In fact, Professor Ahlborn's discussion confronts the reality that travel in the opposite direction is heartbreakingly observable. In the 2020s, it is apparent that the exercise of power has become privatized, and with it, certain aspects of the international legal order. The objective of those advocating for the NIEO was to control and restrict the power of corporations, but this has grown rather than diminished. This is a reality of which even non-experts in the discipline have some awareness, but the extent and implications of it are far greater than many people imagine. Dr. Ahlborn explores how tech companies, a basket that includes a diverse family of corporate entities, reveal how corporate power operates beyond the reach of state authority in a variety of disturbing ways, and yet, at the same time, are able to conceal themselves behind the state's corporate veil. Consequently, they are able to effectively evade accountability under international law, a situation that is neither in the interest of justice nor collective human flourishing. It would be disturbing if this was the only dimension to consider, but Professor Ahlborn will also address how corporations push their way into traditional intergovernmental fora. They fund international organizations and on a practical de facto basis participate in lawmaking processes. At the same time, the culture of international organizations has been reshaped in the image of the corporate world. They are increasingly adopting modes of running that mirror company practices, emphasizing efficiency and output, adopting business styles, performance indicators, and restructuring internal bureaucratic hierarchies. In light of all of these and other considerations, Professor Ahlborn, this lecture will explore what is left of the promise of the NIEO to foster equality and equity among developing and developed states in their economic relations. Clearly, this is a daunting remit, but I have zero doubt of your capacity to deliver. Without question, Professor White would be so pleased with our endeavors this afternoon, even though she would undoubtedly be very sad with the trajectory that the international relations have taken over the decades, as I mentioned, and still an optimist. Nevertheless, the fact that engaging scholarship is seeking to find ways forward, I reckon, would also be very heartening to Gillian White, as it is most certainly to all of us. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the 2026 Gillian White Lecture. I'm honored to give this lecture, which is named after such a trailblazing woman in international law academia. And I'm truly delighted to be in Manchester for the first time, to meet old friends and to make new ones, I hope. When I was invited to give this lecture, I thought about what topic to choose, a topic that should connect Gillian White's legacy with the contemporary challenges in international law. And challenges is, of course, an understatement. I mean, many speak of international law being at a time of rupture, international law being dead. So we are all having a very pessimistic outlook at the moment. There definitely seems to be agreement that the rules-based international legal order, the liberal international legal order, is undergoing fundamental changes and maybe even ending. To find a topic for this lecture, my attention then turned to, as already mentioned, Professor White's most seminal, or one of her most seminal pieces, her article on the new international economic order, which she wrote 50 years ago. In the middle of the Cold War, and at a time when the international legal order saw many new members emerging, newly developing, newly independent states in the context of decolonization. Like today, observers back then saw the international legal order at a stage of transformation. By using the different characteristics of the new international economic order, or NEO in short, I intend to show that many of the developments we see in international law today are not so much the sign of a rupture with the past, but the outcome of complex and gradual developments. I titled my lecture "The New International Economic Disorder of Law, Privatization and Power" to make one simple argument. In my view, the principal ordering dynamic of our time is privatization. We saw the beginnings of the privatization of international law at the inception of the NEO already, but it has become even more pronounced over time and dominates contemporary international relations today. What do I mean by privatization? In my view, privatization has two elements. First, we have, again, stronger emphasis on horizontal, national, interest-driven international law. Now, there was always a horizontal dimension to international law, obviously, because we don't have a centralized authority. But those private law horizontal elements have been overshadowed by international community talk, by community interest emphasis. Second, I mean by privatization that power is being held by private actors, notably corporations. Both sides of this privatization development are not unrelated. The rise of private actors has led to the infiltration of public institutions without much control and regulation. And this is also the fault of the liberal international economic order, or international order generally, because liberal in the economic context means very little regulation. To make my argument that the ordering dynamic of our time is privatization, I will again be inspired by Gillian White's article. And I will structure my lecture in terms of the four elements of the NEO. The new, followed by international, followed then by economic, and finally we will consider the term order or potential disorder. For those of you who are expecting a great PowerPoint presentation, I only have one slide, which I will show to you in the middle of the presentation. So you have to look at me and listen to me. So let's begin. What's the meaning of new? In the context of the NEO, we should understand the term new as part of a broader and complex development. The appetite of newly independent states to form and shape their own rules and to restructure the international economic system. As many of you will know, the NEO was proclaimed in 1974 through a General Assembly resolution, the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, a corresponding action plan also in a General Assembly resolution, and then the so-called Charter on the Economic Rights and Duties of States. By means of those resolutions, developing states, especially through the group of G77, aim to formalize their efforts to restructure the global economic system. But not all rules in these founding documents were actually new. The fundamental principles in Chapter 1 of the Charter, for example, contained established rules and principles of international law. So we find non-aggression there, non-intervention, peaceful settlement of disputes, sovereign equality, equal rights to self-determination, and so on. This analysis highlights that the qualifier new ultimately also is a matter of perspective. For those states that had just become independent, the established rules and principles were actually new. For the newly independent states, the proclamation of the NEO was an opportunity to say which ones of the older rules did they actually accept or find useful, and which ones should be changed. How should they participate in customary international lawmaking? In her article on the NEO, Gillian White had a great sensitivity toward the subjectiveness of the qualifier new. She noted that her perspective was, and I quote, that of a lawyer educated in a developed Western country having a mixed market economy with some state-owned enterprises and for most of her lifetime a welfare state. Accordingly, she acknowledged that her perspective, like the perspective of many of us in this room, is necessarily different from those that were actually having the debates on the NEO. In that sense, Professor White was actually not only a trailblazer for women in international law, but actually also for broader critiques stating that states from the Global South have not participated in customary international lawmaking, and they had no opportunity to actually shape those foundational rules that determined their economic and other relations. That being said, the NEO is best known for rights that were genuinely new in international law, even though they were partly derived from existing rules of international law. A list of those rules includes permanent sovereignty over natural resources, the right to choose an economic system, the right to development, the right to participate in economic decision-making, the right to regulate corporations, and the right to fair and preferential treatment in trade. Looking ahead to today, the question is, which of these rights have actually become part of the fabric of international law? Has the NEO been materialized to any extent? We don't have the time to answer that question here for each and every right in the NEO founding documents. Of course, it is well known that the right to development became adopted in a General Assembly resolution as a human right in 1986, and I believe that Diane DiSerto has given a previous Gillian White lecture on this topic, actually. But I want to zoom in on another right in the NEO founding document, which is more in line with my overall argument on privatization, the right to regulate corporations. This right is tightly connected with many of the other aspects of the NEO. Again, we should understand that the emphasis on the right to regulation it has to be seen in a broader historical context, not in terms of specific events, but as part of a struggle against Western or global North domination over the global South. Even after decolonization, states from the global North, or developed states, continue to dominate the global South through their corporations. Some here speak of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism. Those corporations pushed back against higher regulatory standards and attempts of developing states to protect their resources against corporate overreach. In fact, for those of you who've read Professor White's article on the NEO, it actually starts with a quote by the US Council of the International Chamber of Commerce, which decried the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties as, and I quote, the cutting edge of a threat to the well-being and even the existence of foreign-owned private enterprise and to the security of foreign investment in many countries. End of quote. Now, if we look at the present, the very recent past, the right to regulate has actually gained traction, notably in the context of the reforms of international investment treaties, but please note, these developments are also pushed by the global North. In my view, these attempts come too late and they are too little. Corporations have become very powerful actors in the international legal system, even though they are not formally recognized. And this brings us to the second element of the phrase new international economic order, the term international. The underlying question of this element of international is who can participate in international economic relations. As White observes in her article, the Charter on Economic Rights and Duties of States recognizes that international is not confined to interstate relations. It does acknowledge that states can cooperate in regional organizations, but more importantly for our discussion today is that in Article 2, we have the right to regulate corporations, explicitly stated. And not only that, the provision actually directly addresses corporations. It's very unusual, by stating that, and I quote, transnational corporations shall, not should, shall, not intervene in the internal affairs of a host state. This could be interpreted as an extension of the prohibition of intervention to corporations, to private actors. The NEO thus illustrated and was part of the broader move to regulate corporations directly under international law and under the auspices of the UN since the 1970s. There were two instruments which were particularly well known and discussed, the Code of Conduct on Transnational Corporations and the norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises with regard to human rights. Unsurprisingly, both of these initiatives failed. Why? because of the pushback from states in the global north that wanted to protect their corporations, and because of really strong business lobbies. And that continues to be a problem today with the regulation of corporations, particularly in the area of human rights. The opponents of those initiatives until today actually note that corporations are not subjects of international law and are not directly bound by international law. Some have therefore noted that if you really want to include corporations in a regulatory debate, the term international, which was coined by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century to actually replace the term the law of nations, is not adequate anymore. We need different terms like transnational or global law to capture the factual reality that corporations have in many cases as much power as states. I'm actually not convinced, though, that alternative terminology is the solution. As long as international law remains our language, our lingua franca in which we speak. Choosing a different term is just playing with words. As corporations are deliberately not part of formal international law, they found other ways to assert their power without being controlled. As I said in my introduction, their ever-increasing power is then part of a privatization of international law, which we will go into now in more detail. We can particularly see that in the third element of the term New International Economic Order, the element of economic. What does economic mean? The founding documents of the NEO illustrate that the term economic is really broad. I already said that in principle, the main documents in the NEO founding era contain some of the foundational rules of international law, and we'll come back to that when we discuss the fourth element, order. But let's first zoom in on economic, the meaning of economic in the strict sense. Interestingly, the realization of some of the aspects of the NEO only became true in the past 2 decades or so, with a greater emphasis on the international community since the end of the Cold War. However, this development has also been undercut by the privatization of international law, both through the increasing dominance of cooperation and a stark return to bilateralism among states. So let's consider the different claims. Again, we cannot go through all of them, but let's look at some of the main claims of the NEO proponents. A first claim was that development states would gain more influence in global financial or economic institutions. And indeed, emerging economies like China and Brazil actually play a much bigger global role. At the institutional level, there were reforms of the voting systems of the IMF and the World Bank to give more voting shares to states from the developing world. And this has particularly led to the increasing influence of China, India, and Brazil. But the European states and the United States of America continue to dominate and have a significant influence in these institutions. And this is why states from the global south have actually turned to creating their own financial institutions. Developing states have created the BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Those are all recent development in the new millennium. But rather than the creation of a global economic order, which was ultimately the aim of the neo-proponents, we now have different economic orders, which exist side by side, like a pluralism of legal orders, which fits with my argument that the prevalent ordering models of today is privatization, which is focused on specialized interests rather than a community interest. Another structural goal of the NEO was fairer trade terms for developing countries. And that goal has been somewhat not achieved, but we were moving towards it in the context of the GATT and the World Trade Organization. And yet free trade does not necessarily mean fair trade. The rules of the WTO still favor industrialized nations. Many developing states remain dependent on exporting raw materials, and they are disadvantaged, for example, by agricultural subsidies coming from developing states. All of this is possible because international economic law in the narrow sense has actually long resisted the communitarian turn in international law, which I mentioned. As James Crawford argued in his Hague lectures on multilateral obligations, the WTO rules actually mainly give rise to bilateral treaty obligations. Therefore, it may not be surprising that the few deeply multilateral trade elements in the WTO, particularly the dispute settlement system, has been unraveling under the pressure of power politics in recent times. This unraveling started, of course, under President Trump during his first term, when he decided not to appoint members to the appellate body anymore. So while the WTO is undergoing reforms, and some have hope, states have actually been concluding bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements for quite a while, and of course investment agreements, trade and investment agreements, they're often taken together these days. These agreements are mostly consistent with the WTO agreements, but the US administration's recent tariff policies obviously flagrantly violate the WTO rules. They are part of President Trump's business-like style of conducting foreign relations in terms of deal-making. We should note that those tariffs do not distinguish between developed and developing states, and they're driven by political considerations, as we all know. But developed states have been in a better position to defend themselves. Regarding developing states, we could say that those tariffs are a means of coercing trade partners, which goes explicitly against the terms of the Charter on Economic Rights and Duties of States, which prohibits economic coercion. A third objective of the NEO was increased development aid and technology transfer. Since the proclamation of the NEO, official development assistance, ODA, has indeed been growing and technologies have been transferred. However, most developed states still do not meet the targets of the UN in terms of providing ODA. In the current global climate, ODA has been further reduced. The US closed USAID, and that significantly affected ODA across the world, around the world. And other major donors, and that is interesting, have actually followed suit. So France, Germany, the UK have all reduced their contributions of ODA. The OECD actually predicts that ODA in 2027 will fall back to 2020 levels. Where the public sector funding ODA has gone out, developing states have become more dependent on private sector funding. Since the debt crisis in the 1980s and subsequent structural reforms, developing countries have actually liberalized their investment regimes, privatized many of their state-owned companies, reduced state control over many sectors, and opened their markets to multinational corporations. In addition, development banks, including those based in developing countries, are using blended finance guarantees and other tools to attract private funding. Traditional international organizations, which suffer from large funding gaps, even larger than before now, as again the US is not really contributing to many of the budgets anymore, are also increasingly relying on funding by corporations. And, as were noted by the introductory remarks, they are also increasingly run like corporations. They have to meet certain efficiency targets. So in practical terms, private actors now play a larger role in development finance and implementation, more than in previous decades, including regarding a fourth claim of the NEO, reduce global inequality. Some states, like China, South Korea, Singapore, have dramatically reduced poverty, and global extreme poverty has fallen since the 1980s. However, inequality generally in many countries has increased. The gap between the richest and the poorest states remains significant. And the emergence of digital technologies, like cyber and AI, might help to close the gap or further widen it. While the UN has actually been very reluctant to regulate anything regarding digital technologies, so cyber and AI, it has adopted a UN Digital Compact, which aims to bridge the digital divide between the global north and the global south. The UN Digital Compact is a soft law instrument, and it is part of a general trend towards soft law making through non-binding instruments. Besides the Digital Compact, UN member states also concluded a global compact on migration and one on refugees. That was in 2018. And of course, there was the first global compact ever, the Global Compact on Business and Human Rights, which illustrates one of the reasons why this format of non-binding compacts is preferable to traditional treaties, namely the involvement of multiple stakeholders, including, again, corporations, also civil society, but notably also corporations. Regarding the digital compact, corporations are especially important because they own those technologies, they develop them, they control them. So they are powerful tools in all aspects of our life. And now here I show you my one slide. Because when I asked ChatGPT to create an image comparing the claims of the NEO with today's international economic order, it gave me this image, even without having heard my lecture. And I can comfort you, I've written my lecture myself. This shows the potential risks of AI. We may all be replaced soon. Now, coming back to our discussion on international lawmaking through soft law instrument, this actually illustrates a broader point. Because this trend to legally non-binding instruments does not only concern itself with multilateral relations, but also with bilateral relations, as evidenced by the stark increase of memoranda of understanding and similar instruments which have an ambiguous legal force. This trend is so significant that the UN International Law Commission has actually decided to take up this topic of non-legally binding instruments into its active agenda. And this observation then allows us to make a more general point. Developments that we've seen in the international economic arena for a while are now impacting general international law. As we mentioned, stable economic relations can only work within a stable framework of general international law. That's why the Charter on Economic Rights and Duties starts with the foundational rules of international law before going into details on economic rights and duties. Instability in the economic domain will likely have an effect on general international law and vice versa. We can all feel that when we want to buy gas these days. The steeply increasing gas prices are the direct consequence of the provision of the use, the violation of the prohibition of the use of force by Israel and the US last weekend. Beyond the level of the individual consumer, obviously, this conflict will have a significant effect on economic relations worldwide and economic growth. Now, this leads us to consider the last element of the NEO, the element of order, the element everyone has been waiting for. Because the question is, do the flagrant violations of the foundational rules of international law in the recent year undermine even the small successes of the NEO in terms of giving a louder voice to the global south? Many have long criticized the liberal rule-based international legal order and have waited for its demise. But the question then is, what will we get in return? What will we get in return for what we had, like a UN-backed benign hegemon legal order? What will replace that? It might be something better, it might be something worse. As I said, I think the international legal order is actually moving back toward a horizontal model, which is characterized by privatization. This model has some of the same traits as the traditional model of international law of coordination, which was horizontal and reciprocity based. But it includes more actors, particularly also corporations, which are no longer objects but also subjects of regulation. Think last week's standoff by the AI company Anthropic against the US government regarding the handover of some of its technologies to the Pentagon is a sign, or it illustrates that corporations can be quite powerful, particularly tech corporations, and they can be significant players in international economic relations. This argument, the argument that we're moving more towards privatization or like a change in the international legal order, which goes back to what we had maybe before the Second World War even, finds support indirectly in Gillian White's article on the NEO. To define order in her article, she actually relies on the work of Georg Schwarzenberger, who was a German UK professor at University College London, and he gave the Welland Schill lecture in the 1960s on economic world order. In that lecture, Schwarzenberger made clear that he is a realist. He concluded that power precedes law in the international economy. And as international law does not have a centralized authority, powerful states use international economic law to pursue their interests. And I think we can currently see that in the practices of China and the United States in their economic relations and beyond. While China has very gradually and silently become a global economic superpower, the US administration has more openly engaged in deal-making, again, often through agreements which are not clearly law or treaties. Both the US and China have always been selective regarding their participation in international institutions or multilateral treaties that do not serve their interests. But the Trump administration has obviously pushed that to an extreme. In the past, the US has merely abstained from joining certain institutions like the International Criminal Court. But now Trump has, of course, created the Board of Peace, which is a whole new kind of international institution, if we even want to call it that way. Schwarzenberger's realist view of the international legal order was starkly influenced by his experience with the two world wars, which is particularly relevant regarding today's or the current state of world affairs. In January 1939, he published an article called "The Rule of Law and the Disintegration of the International Society" in the American Journal of International Law. In that piece, he captured the spirit of his time, quoting different passages or statements by European and American statesmen. I wish it would have been women, but it's unfortunately men. So, for example, the US Secretary of State spoke of, and I quote, "a world growing internationally more and more disordered and chaotic," end of quote. And the UK Foreign Minister noted that we are living in one of those great periods of history which are awe-inspiring in their responsibilities and in their consequences. Stupendous forces are loose, hurricane forces. Those statements could have been made today. And there are indeed some commentators that see us in some kind of pre-war period as we did prior to World War II. Last year, The Guardian published an article titled "We Are in 1938 Now, Putin's War in Ukraine and Lessons from History." Based on these observations, Schwarzenberger concluded that the international community had been disintegrating into an international society which lacked common values. To conclude, what do these experiences of the past tell us for today and maybe even for the future? It seems like the international community is moving or shifting towards an international society again. Treaty law was the first area of general international law which became more bilateralized, again more privatized, and the law of international responsibility has followed suit. As the Russian and US violations of the prohibition of the use of force illustrate, we are back in an era of private international law enforcement outside the UN framework. And many other states are playing along, not only by acquiescing, but, and that seems counterintuitive, by taking unilateral and multilateral sanctions, which are measures of self-help. They're actually countermeasures in a horizontal legal system. As Schwarzenberger noted in his 1939 article, and I quote, "In a society in which the interests of members are primarily conflicting, the main concern of each entity must necessarily be directed towards self-preservation." It remains to be seen whether we return to the great powers balance of power system that has been the dominating paradigm of international law for actually most of its existence. One decisive difference I see, though, is that we have more players today, including corporations and more economic integration, which might actually be a good thing in terms of the future development of the international legal order. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.